What's up guys, and welcome to another Porsche GT car comparison. You guys just keep offering up your GT3s, GT4s, and RSs, and I'm never gonna say no because these are some of my favorite cars in the world. Today we are comparing a 991.2 GT3 with a 6-speed manual, which we're currently sitting in, against a 981 generation GT4 with a 4.5 liter DeMan engine making around 460 wheel horsepower. And we'll finish things up by comparing these two against the 997.2 GT3. And the one thing that these three GT cars all have in common is that they have a market value in the $160,000 to $180,000 range. This 991.2 GT3 has been going for $180,000 to $200,000, and there's a really good reason. This is one of the best, most well-rounded sports cars you can buy at any price. And the fact that you can get one with a manual makes it even sweeter to the true driving enthusiast. So the owner Carmen mentioned that this car has the DSC controller, which retunes the adaptive shocks. He also has these Porsche bucket seats that have been tilted back by 1.5 degrees, I believe he said. It makes the seating position so much better. The stock seating position is way too upright for me, so I really like this mod. He's also got some HRE wheels. They look beautiful on this car. They're wrapped in PS4S rubber, 10 millimeters wider, so 255 in the front, 315 in the back. We're powered by a 4-liter naturally aspirated flat-six engine, makes 500 horsepower, 339 pound-feet of torque, and of course it has a 9,000 RPM redline. Car weighs just under 3,200 pounds, mechanical LSD on the rear axle, electric power steering. Let's take it for a drive and use this as the baseline against which to compare the modified GT4 and that beautiful 997.2 GT3. Thankfully, this car does have front axle lift. We'll open up the stock exhaust valve and we'll have it in sport mode. Pretty damp road today, so we're gonna take it a little easy, leave all the systems on, just get a feel for this car. The stock exhaust is actually milder than I thought. The last couple I've driven have had aftermarket exhausts fitted. Gotta love that auto rev match. We're leaving that on as well. The thing I love about this car is just how easy it is to drive quickly and how well all the controls work together. The steering is precise. The shifter is really positive in the way it slots into each gate. And even though the front end of this car is nowhere near as sharp as that of the 992 GT3, at canyon speeds it honestly doesn't really matter because this car has so much traction and grip and precision at the front end. And that engine, the response is just, it's a thing of beauty. It really is. We won't be getting engines like this for much longer. So pick these cars up while you can. And with this PASM suspension with the DSC controller in the softer setting, it feels good. It feels stiff, but very well controlled. Oh yes. Never tire of a naturally aspirated flat six, especially one that revs to 9. Whoa. This car moves around on its tippy toes quite a bit. Part of that could be due to the DSC controller and the way it's tuned. But with PS4S tires, this thing has so much traction, and that rear engine, so much weight over the rear axle. Pretty long gearing from this 6-speed manual, as I've mentioned in other videos. I wish it was a little shorter so we could wind this engine out to 9 grand a little more frequently. Wow. Honestly, for a naturally aspirated 6-cylinder engine, this car has so much straight line performance. It really does. With 4 liters of displacement, there's actually torque everywhere, even at the lower RPMs. one of the best all-around sports cars that money can buy. It truly is. This car has remained in the top 5 or 6 of my Zygrene Performance Index for so long, ever since I drove the first one. Must have been 3 to 4 years back. But this thing is just almost faultless. You have that glorious naturally aspirated engine and the sound and response that comes with that. A really well-tuned suspension even from the factory. I would say the DSC controller is only needed if you really want to push this thing to the limit. Excellent brakes from the factory as well. Ultra precise steering. Not a ton of feedback because it is an EPS after all. But for an EPS, it is one of the best out there. And actually better than the new 992's steering rack in my opinion. It's got a great interior. It's refined. Other than quite a bit of road noise at speed, this car is really comfortable. Then when you push it, it just comes alive. Oh my gosh. One of the best cars of all time. And I love that with the stock exhaust, you get more induction note from inside the car. It's not as loud as something like a GT4 RS, but I would say this is more enjoyable more of the time because it's not just ear-splittingly loud. You know what? This actually has pretty good steering feel. Over the bumps, I can just feel the steering wheel jiggling around in my hands. GT3, setting the standard so high. It's time to see if those other two cars even stand a chance at being more enjoyable than this. And now with a press of a button, we get the nose lifted up. What a great feature. Check out these beauties. And my NSX, my poor little NSX in the front with its 270 horsepower. All right, so we're now in the 2016 Cayman GT4 with the DeMan 4.5 liter engine. I've been curious about this engine setup for so long. Tons of GT4 owners seem to love this modification. The numbers speak for themselves. I mean, 4.5 liters, this one is rated at around 460 plus wheel horsepower, according to the owner Corey. But with the 718 GT4, these have been known to reach 500 plus. So that actually makes this engine about as powerful, maybe slightly more powerful than the 4 liter in the 991.2 GT3. Redline is still about the same. Corey mentioned it should still be 7,800, but Corey has also done some other very important mods, including shortened gears 1 through 5, a lightweight flywheel, an upgraded clutch, DeMan Motorsport catted headers, Fabspeed X-Pipe, guards LSD, and he has the factory suspension, but it's been lowered by 10 millimeters. Bucket seats that have also been tilted back, and these amazing seat inserts. Very cool black and white checkered pattern. Specs about the car, well, when it was stock, it had a 3.8 liter engine carried over from the 991.1 Carrera S, and that only was rated for 385 horsepower. So this now makes something like 150 additional horsepower, but the car should still only weigh around 3,000 pounds, so a couple hundred pounds lighter than the GT3, and of course it's mid-engine. We still have electric power steering, and this engine package, the DeMan Motorsport package, with the flywheel, the short gears, and everything, it should have cost around $50,000. It might be more nowadays, but if you do the math, you can buy a GT4, a clean one, for about $100,000 to $110,000. Now, assuming the price of the DeMan package has gone up, you're pretty much looking at 991.2 GT3 territory for one of these cars. So the question is it worth it? Does this feel quicker in a straight line? Is it more fun to drive because of its mid-engine layout and the short gears? Let's find out. Corey also has the DSC controller on this. We're gonna leave it in the softer setting, and we're gonna leave sport mode off for this one just because I wanna see what the throttle response feels like when I go to heel toe downshift. Wow, okay. That was barely a blip of the throttle, and the revs just shot up. little tricky to heel toe with this car because the throttle response is so much sharper than stock. Oh my goodness, that torque. 4.5 liters of displacement is no joke when it comes to additional low-end torque. The sound of the engine isn't all that different than stock. I mean, listen to that. It's nowhere near as razor-edged and high-pitched as that GT3 engine. Brakes feel good. Oh my gosh, that throttle response. It's almost on-off switch. Wow. Now, one thing I'm noticing right away is that this shifter, while still excellent, it doesn't feel quite as mechanical as that 991.2 shifter. All right, first gear. Oh, yes. It feels every bit of 460 wheel horsepower. And with the short gears, it's a lively car. We're on some Dunlop summer tires, a little bit more aggressive than a PS4S. And oh my gosh, this car is so capable. But you do have to be careful because it is mid-engine. It doesn't quite have the rear end traction of that GT3, and it's a little bit more eager to rotate on throttle. Wow. What a car, what a car. You know, one thing I'll say though is this engine sound is not nearly as exciting as I was hoping for. I was hoping that this DeMan engine would really wake up the high-pitched, high RPM sound of this engine compared to the stock 3.8 liter, but unfortunately, I would say it sounds about the same. It still has that nice flat six growl, but it doesn't have that zingy high-pitched nature towards the red line, and it doesn't rev that high. I mean, 8,000 RPM is a high red line by modern standards, but that's where the GT3 engine just starts waking up. So I guess if you're looking for GT3 levels of performance, the DeMan engine absolutely delivers. But if you're looking for GT3 levels of sound and theater, this doesn't quite hit the mark for me. But it is a drastically more powerful car than a standard GT4. And I just love how much more willing this car is to rotate compared to the GT3. This one really just feels like it wants to pivot around its center point, whereas the GT3, you kind of have to fight a little bit of, I won't even call it understeer at canyon speeds, but a little bit of resistance at the front end when you first turn into a corner. Not the case with the mid-engine GT4. And finally, this car gets the power it deserves. Obviously, you can shell out for a GT4 RS, but for a lot less money, you get just as much straight line performance with this setup. The steering feel is excellent for an E-Pass, similar to that 991.2. Brakes feel excellent as well. Really can't go wrong with Porsche GT cars in terms of the controls. What an interesting experience. This was not what I was expecting from the DeMan 4.5 liter engine. In terms of power, yes, it lives up to the hype, but it's interesting how much of the original character is retained here. It's powerful, no doubt, but something is just a little missing at that top end for me. The engine of that 991.2 still is something truly special. But now it's time to hop into the 997.2 GT3. Let's go back over a decade and see if the older car is still the most enjoyable. And last but not least, the 997.2 Porsche 911 GT3. This is a 2010 model year, and the owner has done a few tasteful mods to this car, just like the owners of those other two cars we just drove. By the way, they're all friends, and they all ship their cars over from the East Coast for the Air Water event in Southern California that just wrapped up last weekend. Mods on this car: Sharkwerks center bypass, guards LSD. He pinned and welded the coolant lines, a very common reliability mod for the 997 generation of GT cars. We have the bucket seats on this car. He also did front bump steer correction, rear toe links, Porsche T-Equipment roll bar, RS door pulls, beautiful BBS E01 wheels. They're 19x9 in the front, 19x12 in the back, and we have the PS4S tires, 245 front, 305 rear. Being a much older car than the other two, you can see this Alcantara wrapped steering wheel is starting to show signs of age with the fraying. The size of this display on the center console is hilarious. The newer ones have got to be at least 3 times as big. But it's a classic design. The 997 interior has always been one that I think overall will age well. So this car is powered by a 3.8-liter Metzger naturally aspirated flat-six engine. It's rated at 435 horsepower and a little over 310 pound-feet of torque. This car weighs around 3,000 pounds, maybe a little more. And in terms of size, it's so much smaller than the 991 and especially the 992. It actually feels a little closer in size to the GT4. This has hydraulic power steering. We're gonna set the PASM dampers to the stiffer setting and enable sport mode to open up the exhaust valve and give us that sharp throttle response that we want. 435 horsepower means this is easily the least powerful car here, but does that make it the least fun to drive as well? First thing I'm noticing, the on-center steering feel is much lighter in this car. Actually, the on-center feel is better in the newer Porsches. But that being said, once you get the front tires loaded up, this has so much more feedback than those EPS racks. Wow. Much higher effort manual transmission. And this feels right away more rear-engined than a 991. You really have to be conscious with your weight transfer. Very long gearing, hard to get out of second gear on this road. So much steering feel coming through this hydraulic rack. I love that. That actually gives me more confidence to attack corners, because I can tell what's going on at the front end. Brake feel is good, but not as good as those newer GT cars. You have to stand on the pedal a little bit harder with this. Ooh. Very sensitive throttle response in sport mode. You just feel this car was built in a different era. It was engineered not to hide its rear engine weight distribution, unlike that 991.2. This one, you definitely feel a little bit of understeer on turn-in. This understeers the most out of these 3 cars by far, but that also gives it its charm. It's an old school 911 driving experience. Wow. Even though this is the least powerful car here, it still makes such a good sound, doesn't it? Metzger engines are just a thing of beauty. Oh yes. This car just feels more raw in every way. The steering, the higher effort clutch and shifter, the suspension, you feel more of what's going on beneath you. You can't carry as much speed speed through the corners, it's more enjoyable at sort of 7 to 8 tenths canyon speeds, because you don't have to wring this thing out to its ragged edge for the car to come alive. Those newer GT cars almost feel, dare I say it, a little too easy to drive. It's all relative, right? But this old 997.2 just, it's the sweet spot. And when I say sweet spot, I mean specifically for this type of driving. Obviously, what I said earlier about the 991.2 being the most well-rounded all-around sports car, that still remains true. But this one feels like a little bit more of an occasion to drive. While the newer cars are very, very technically impressive, they don't transmit that minutia through the steering wheel. And there's no arguing that this engine sounds far better than that 4.5 liter DeMan. Awesome. Anyways, does this engine sound as good as the 4 liter in the 991.2 GT3? I would say yes. It's a different type of sound, but to me, it's just as enjoyable. It's a little bit more raw. It doesn't have the smooth revving nature of that newer engine, but it still revs to well over 8,200 RPM. And it makes a glorious motorsport sound at the top end. And I would say this engine sounds more interesting in the mid-range compared to that 4 liter. The 4 liter, you really have to rev it above 7,000 to get the best sound out of it. But this one sounds good even in the mid-range. Wow. A Metzger powered anything, GT3, GT2, RS, it doesn't matter. These are some of the best cars ever. But now it's time for a conclusion, a very difficult conclusion indeed. If I had to sum up these 3 cars and how they compare at a very similar price point, what I said earlier still remains true 100% about the 991.2 GT3 being the best all-around sports car. You have that high red line, you have the nice interior, some of the creature comforts that are missing in this 997 obviously, but it also just feels like a more complete package than the GT4. Even with that GT4's DeMan engine, it doesn't feel quite as cohesive as the 991.2. But between the Cayman GT4 with the DeMan motor and this still gives you a lot more rawness, a lot more theater, but without the pinpoint razor sharp precision of that GT4. The GT4 is the best handling car of all 3 at canyon speeds. The GT4 feels the sharpest, it feels the most pointy, but it also has the least special engine, even with that 4.5 liter upgrade. For my style of driving, for this type of driving, this 997.2 is still easily the most enjoyable because you feel everything. It's raw, it's much closer in ethos, I would say, to my 91 NSX that is parked right in front of us. As much as I love the handling of the GT4 and the extra torque of that DeMan motor, and as much as I love the rawness and the sheer driving pleasure of this 997.2, I'm a sucker for well-roundedness. And that 991.2 GT3 to me is still one of the most well-rounded sports cars and driver's cars that money can buy. So big shout out to the owners for letting me review their 3 Porsche GT cars. Let me know how you think these 3 cars compare. For your money, for your $160,000 to $180,000, which would you choose? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.